General Vorath Keln walked into the great council chamber with heavy steps. He had served the Dominion Empire for 300 years. He had conquered worlds and crushed rebellions. He had seen species rise and fall like waves on a shore. But today he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt afraid. The chamber was vast and dark. 12 council members sat on their high thrones, looking down at him like gods looking down at an insect. Their pale faces showed no emotion. Their silver eyes reflected the soft glow of holographic displays floating in the air around them. High Counselor Maven spoke first. Her voice was cold and sharp like a blade made of ice. She asked why the general had requested this meeting. She reminded him that the council had already made its decision about the Vethrani border worlds. The invasion would proceed as planned. Vorath bowed his head in respect, but he did not back down. He told the council that he had come to beg them one last time. He asked them to leave the humans alone. He said the Vethrani worlds were not worth the risk of provoking humanity. The council members looked at each other with amusement. One of them laughed openly. He said the humans were nothing. They were a young species barely 100 years into space travel. Their fleet was tiny. Their technology was primitive. They posed no threat to an empire that had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years. Vorath shook his head slowly. He told them they did not understand. He said he had spent years studying humanity. He had read their history. He had watched their transmissions. He had analyzed their wars and their culture and their psychology. And what he had found terrified him. He activated his personal display and projected images into the center of the chamber. The council members saw humans fighting in muddy trenches with primitive weapons. They saw humans storming beaches while explosions tore their friends apart around them. They saw humans marching through frozen wastelands with nothing but determination keeping them alive. Vorath explained that these images came from a period humans called the World Wars. In just 30 years they had fought 2 global conflicts that killed over 100 million of their own kind. 100 million dead, and they did not collapse. They did not surrender. They did not give up and accept defeat. Instead, they rebuilt their cities and grew stronger and more advanced than before. Counselor Maven waved her hand dismissively. She said that was ancient history. She said it had no bearing on the present situation. The Dominion fleet outnumbered the human fleet, 20-1. The outcome of any conflict would be obvious. Vorath felt frustration building in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. He told the council that numbers meant nothing when facing humanity. He said humans did not fight the way other species fought. They did not calculate odds and retreat when the mathematics turned against them. They did not value their own survival above their cause. He showed them more images. Human soldiers throwing themselves on explosives to save their companions. Human pilots crashing their damaged ships into enemy vessels. Human medics running into fire to drag wounded friends to safety. Over and over he showed them examples of humans choosing death over defeat. The council watched in silence. Some of them seemed uncomfortable. Others looked bored. None of them truly understood what they were seeing. Vorath tried one more time. He told them that humans had a concept they called total war. When pushed far enough, they did not just fight with their military. They turned their entire civilization into a weapon. Factories ran day and night producing weapons. Scientists worked without sleep, developing new technologies. Civilians trained with whatever weapons they could find. Every man and woman and child became part of the war effort. He said the Dominion had never faced an enemy like this. Every species they had conquered had eventually broken. They had accepted defeat when the cost became too high. But humans did not break. The higher the cost, the harder they fought. Pain and loss did not weaken them. It made them angry. And an angry human was the most dangerous creature in the galaxy. High Counselor Maven stood from her throne. Her silver eyes were cold with contempt. She told Vorath that she had heard enough. She said his warnings sounded like cowardice, dressed up as wisdom. The Dominion had not built an empire spanning 1,000 worlds by fearing primitive species with delusions of significance. She announced that the invasion of the Vethrani border worlds would proceed as scheduled. If the humans objected, they would be crushed like every other species that had dared to challenge the Dominion. She dismissed Vorath and told him to prepare his fleet for the operation. Vorath stood motionless for a long moment. He looked at each council member in turn, searching for any sign that his words had reached them. He found nothing but arrogance and certainty. They truly believed they were invincible. They truly believed that 10,000 years of victory meant they could never lose. He bowed one final time and asked that his objections be formally recorded in the official archives. Maven agreed with a dismissive wave. Vorath turned and walked out of the chamber. The great doors closed behind him with a sound like a tomb sealing shut. 3 months later, the Dominion Third Fleet crossed into Vethrani space. The conquest was quick and brutal. The Vethrani had no chance against such overwhelming force. Their worlds fell one by one like dominoes pushed by a careless hand. Within 2 months, the annexation was complete. The humans sent a single ship. Ambassador Linda Morrison arrived at the Dominion Administrative Center with a formal protest. She was a small woman, with gray hair and calm eyes. She spoke clearly, and without emotion. She said Earth condemned the invasion. She said it violated interstellar law and threatened regional stability. She demanded immediate withdrawal. The Dominion representative laughed at her. He told her that human concerns were irrelevant. He said the Vethrani had been liberated from their inefficient government. Any interference would be met with overwhelming force. Ambassador Morrison listened without expression. When the representative finished speaking, she simply nodded. She said she understood their position and would convey it to her government. Then she paused and her calm eyes turned cold. She told the representative to give his masters a message. She said, "Humanity remembered." She said they always remembered. The representative did not understand what she meant. He dismissed her words as empty posturing. Ambassador Morrison returned to Earth and the Vethrani annexation faded from galactic news. But in the quiet spaces between stars, humanity had already begun to prepare. Factories increased production. Soldiers intensified their training. Scientists worked on new weapons and new tactics. The humans did not make threats or demands. They did not posture or bluster. They simply got ready for war. Commander Daniel Burke stood on the bridge of the carrier Endurance and watched the tactical display with steady eyes. His crew moved around him in focused silence. No one spoke unless they needed to speak. No one moved unless they needed to move. The ship hummed with quiet power, like a predator waiting to pounce. Lieutenant Patricia Vance reported from her station. She said all squadrons were ready. The strike package was loaded and standing by. 200 pilots sat in their cockpits, waiting for the order that would change everything. Burke asked how long until they reached the target. Vance told him 14 minutes at current speed. 14 minutes until humanity announced its entry into this war. 14 minutes until the Dominion learned what a terrible mistake they had made. The supply depot ahead of them had no idea they were coming. Human stealth technology was something the Dominion had consistently underestimated. Their sensors were designed to detect threats they understood. They had never faced an enemy that could move through space like a ghost. Burke studied the depot on his display. It was massive. 72 Dominion warships were docked there, taking on fuel and supplies. Storage facilities held enough resources for a year of operations. Communication relays linked the depot to a dozen occupied systems. Destroying it would blind an entire sector of enemy space. His tactical officer spoke up with concern in his voice. He said he was detecting unusual readings from the depot. The Dominion ships seemed to be cycling their shield generators. It could be scheduled maintenance, or it could mean they had somehow detected the human fleet. Burke considered this for a moment. If they had been spotted, this could be a trap. The Dominion might have warships waiting to ambush them. But the strategic value of the depot was too great to abandon. They had to take the risk. He ordered the fleet to maintain its approach, but told his crew to bring point defense systems to standby. If the Dominion had made them, he wanted to be ready to fight his way out. The minutes passed slowly. Burke watched the depot grow larger on his display. He thought about his daughter back on Earth. She was 8 years old and believed her father was away on a boring survey mission. He thought about the Vethrani refugees he had met during the planning stages. Families torn apart by the invasion. Children who had watched their parents dragged away to labor camps. He thought about what he was about to do and what it would cost. The depot was staffed by thousands of Dominion personnel. Most of them were not soldiers. They were technicians and engineers and administrators. People who had probably never fired a weapon in their lives. In a few minutes, they would all be dead. Burke had made peace with this necessity long ago. War was not clean. War was not fair. The Dominion had started this conflict when they ignored humanity's warnings and invaded Vethrani space. Now they would learn that humanity finished what others started. Vance announced that they were in strike range. Burke took a deep breath and opened a channel to his squadrons. He told them to prepare to launch on his mark. 200 pilots responded with quiet acknowledgement. Burke gave the order. All squadrons launch. The Endurance shuddered as strike craft burst from her launch bays. They scattered into the void like seeds thrown by a farmer. Each small ship carried enough firepower to crack a moon. They raced toward the depot in perfect formation, moving too fast and too quiet for the enemy defenses to track. The depot's automated weapons came online seconds later, but they were designed for a different kind of threat. They expected missiles and torpedoes moving in predictable patterns. They did not expect 200 small craft that could think and adapt and find the weakest points in any defense. The first wave hit the shield generators. Their specialized warheads did not explode in the traditional sense. They disrupted the energy fields that held the barriers in place. The shields flickered and stuttered and died like candles blown out by a sudden wind. The second wave hit the communication relays. Every antenna and transmitter and backup system was destroyed in the span of 3 seconds. The depot went dark and silent. No distress calls would reach the Dominion fleet. No warnings would spread to other systems. The third wave hit everything else. Burke watched the depot come apart on his display. Fuel reserves ignited in cascading explosions. Docked ships broke loose from their moorings and tumbled into each other. Defensive platforms spun wildly as their control systems fried. Secondary explosions rippled through the structure as ammunition stores cooked off. It was over in less than 5 minutes. Where the depot had stood, there was now only an expanding cloud of debris and fire. 72 warships destroyed. Thousands of enemy personnel killed. An entire sector of Dominion operations crippled in a single blow. His tactical officer reported quietly. Target destroyed. No survivors detected. Burke nodded and ordered recovery operations. He told his crew to get their pilots home. The strike craft began their return runs, threading through the debris field with careful precision. His executive officer, Commander Samuel Grant, approached with a troubled expression. He said the words that Burke was already thinking. 72 ships. Probably 10,000 crew. First blood. Burke acknowledged this without emotion. He knew what they had done. He knew the weight of those deaths would stay with him forever. But he also knew that this was only the beginning. Grant said the Dominion would come for them now. They would bring everything they had. They would want revenge for this humiliation. Burke turned to face him. His eyes were calm, but there was something hard beneath the surface. Something old and cold and patient. He said yes, they would come, and humanity would be ready for them. He addressed his crew with quiet authority. He ordered them to set course for the rally point at maximum stealth. He told them they had a long war ahead, and this attack was just the opening move. The Dominion had no idea what they had awakened. They would learn soon enough. The Endurance turned and slipped back into the darkness between stars. Behind them, the debris field expanded slowly, carrying the remains of the depot and its crew into the void. The first message had been sent. Humanity was coming. Across the galaxy, the news spread like fire through dry grass. A human fleet had appeared from nowhere and destroyed a major Dominion installation. Thousands were dead. An entire sector had gone dark. The invincible empire had been struck a blow it never saw coming. General Vorath Keln received the report in his quarters. He read it twice to make sure he understood. Then he sat down heavily and stared at the wall for a long time. He had warned them. He had begged them to leave humanity alone. They had not listened. And now, the war he had feared had finally begun. He wondered how many more would die before the Council understood their mistake. He wondered if understanding would come too late to save them. Outside his window, the stars burned cold and distant. Somewhere out there, human ships were moving through the darkness. Planning. Preparing. Waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. The Dominion had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years. But Vorath knew in his heart that those days were ending. The humans had come, and nothing would ever be the same. General Vorath Keln had seen many battles in his 3 centuries of service. He had witnessed the fall of empires and the extinction of species. He had commanded fleets that darkened the skies of 100 worlds. He had thought himself hardened to the horrors of war. He had been wrong. The tactical display before him showed what the strategists called the contested zone. It was a region of space that had swallowed 14 Dominion fleets in 18 months. Human forces had turned it into a nightmare that defied everything the Dominion understood about warfare. His aide approached with another report. His voice was tired and his hands trembled slightly as he handed over the data tablet. He said the 7th Assault Group had engaged human forces at Marker 17. Casualties were significant. Vorath asked him to define significant. The aide swallowed hard. He said 40% losses in the first hour. Admiral Severin was requesting immediate reinforcements to continue the operation. Vorath studied the display carefully. The 7th Assault Group had been sent to secure a single transit corridor. One corridor defended by perhaps a dozen human warships. They had lost 40% of their strength in 60 minutes. He denied the request for reinforcements. He ordered Admiral Severin to withdraw and regroup immediately. His aide protested. He said if they abandoned the corridor, they would lose control of the entire sector. Months of progress would be erased. Vorath cut him off sharply. He said they would lose one corridor. If they sent reinforcements, they would lose those ships too. The humans had mined the entire approach. Every vessel they sent was another vessel that would be destroyed. The aide fell silent and withdrew. Vorath walked to the observation window and stared out at the stars. Somewhere out there, human ships were waiting in the darkness, watching, planning, setting traps that claimed more Dominion lives every day. That was what made them so terrifying. Not their technology, which was still inferior to Dominion systems. Not their numbers, which remained laughably small compared to the Imperial fleet. It was their patience, their willingness to wait for exactly the right moment, their ability to sacrifice pieces of their force to destroy larger pieces of the enemy. They fought like they had already accepted death, like survival meant nothing compared to victory. Like the only thing that mattered was taking as many Dominion ships with them as possible. A communication alert interrupted his thoughts. His aide announced that the High Council was demanding a status update. Priority transmission. Vorath closed his eyes for a moment and gathered his composure. Then, he ordered the transmission displayed. High Counselor Maven appeared on the screen. She looked older than she had 18 months ago. The silver in her eyes had dulled. Lines of stress marked her pale face. She demanded an explanation for the continued failures in the contested zone. Vorath reminded her calmly that he had never promised quick victory. He had urged caution from the beginning. He had warned them about what humanity was capable of. His objections were recorded in the official archives. Maven's expression hardened. She said the council did not appreciate reminders of past decisions. They required solutions, not excuses. Vorath felt something cold settle in his stomach. He told her plainly that there were no easy solutions. The humans had adapted to every tactic the Dominion employed. They anticipated every strategy before it could be implemented. They fought with creativity and ferocity that Imperial forces could not match. Maven insisted this was impossible. Dominion technology was superior. Dominion numbers were overwhelming. Victory should have been achieved months ago. Vorath pulled up a new display showing the casualty figures. He told her to look at the numbers. 18 months ago, the Dominion controlled 90% of the contested zone. Today, they controlled less than 40%. Fleet losses had exceeded all projections by a factor of 12. Supply lines were under constant attack, and for every human ship destroyed, 2 more seemed to appear. He explained that this was what humans called attrition warfare. They had learned it fighting each other in their own bloody history. They did not need to match the Dominion fleet. They did not need to win decisive battles. They just needed to make every engagement cost the Empire more than it cost them. Eventually, the mathematics became unsustainable. Maven stared at the figures in silence. For the first time, Vorath saw doubt in her expression. She asked what he recommended. Vorath spoke carefully. He said they needed to negotiate immediately. They needed to offer a ceasefire and withdraw from Vethrani space. It was the only way to end this war before it consumed them entirely. Maven rejected this instantly. She said the Dominion did not surrender to lesser species. It was unthinkable. The other subject races would see it as weakness. The Empire would collapse. Vorath shook his head. He said the Empire was already collapsing. Every week brought more losses. Every month stretched their resources thinner. The humans were bleeding them slowly and constantly, and there was nothing the Dominion could do to stop it. He leaned forward and held her gaze through the screen. He told her they had not yet seen humanity on the offensive. Right now they were only defending. They were absorbing attacks and grinding down the Imperial fleet, but their production was increasing. Their technology was improving. Their experience was growing. He said when humanity decided to stop defending and start attacking, the Dominion would face something it had never faced before. He had studied human history. He knew what they did to enemies who refused to surrender. Cities burned to ash, populations scattered, industries shattered beyond repair. They did not conquer, they annihilated. Maven asked if he truly believed humans could threaten the Dominion itself. The question was meant to sound dismissive, but Vorath heard the fear beneath it. He answered honestly. He said given enough time and motivation, he believed humanity could threaten anyone in the galaxy. They were not like other species. They did not know when to quit. They did not accept defeat, even when defeat was certain. And that made them the most dangerous enemy the Dominion had ever faced. The transmission ended abruptly. Vorath suspected his words had finally reached through the Council's arrogance. He hoped it was not too late for them to act on the truth. He returned to the observation window and watched the stars. Reports continued to arrive throughout the night. Another convoy ambushed. Another patrol destroyed. Another system falling silent as human forces cut communication lines. The Dominion was dying. Slowly, painfully. One ship at a time, and one system at a time. The humans were not trying to defeat them in glorious battle. They were simply grinding them down like rocks worn smooth by endless water. Vorath wondered how long the Empire could endure. He wondered if the Council would find wisdom before it was too late. He wondered if he would live to see the end of this war. Outside the window, the stars burned on, indifferent to the suffering of empires and the death of worlds. The universe did not care who won or lost. It simply watched and waited for the final outcome. And somewhere in the darkness, human ships continued their patient, deadly work. Captain Michelle Torres stood on the bridge of the battleship Relentless, and felt something she had not felt in 3 years of war. She felt hope. The tactical display before her showed 47 human warships arranged in perfect formation. It was the largest offensive fleet humanity had ever assembled. Behind them stretched a supply train that reached back across light years. Ammunition carriers and fuel tankers, and repair vessels and hospital ships. Everything they needed to sustain a prolonged campaign in enemy territory. They were no longer defending. They were no longer bleeding the Dominion through ambushes and raids. They were taking the war to the enemy homeland. Her tactical officer reported that all ships were ready. The fleet was in position and awaiting orders. The moment they had prepared for had finally arrived. Torres asked about the status of the Dominion Defense Fleet. Her officer studied his display and reported that enemy forces were fragmenting. The Dominion had pulled units from across their empire to reinforce the home system, but coordination was poor. Intelligence suggested their command structure was in chaos. 3 years of attrition had broken something fundamental in the Dominion military. They had lost too many experienced officers, too many veteran crews, too many ships that could never be replaced. The empire that had once seemed invincible was now struggling to defend its own capital. Torres opened a channel to the fleet. Her voice was calm and steady as she addressed her fellow commanders. She told them that in a few hours they would engage the largest Dominion force they had ever faced. Some of them would not survive. That was the reality of what they were about to do. She did not offer false comfort or empty promises. She respected them too much for that. She reminded them why they were here. 3 years ago, the Dominion had thought they could bully humanity into submission. They had looked at human technology and human numbers, and decided that Earth was too weak to matter. They had invaded Vethrani space and laughed at human protests. Torres smiled grimly. She said they had been wrong about humanity. They had been wrong from the very beginning. They did not understand what humans were capable of. They did not understand what humans were willing to sacrifice. She pointed at the tactical display showing the enemy system ahead. She said today they would remind the Dominion of that mistake. They would take the fight to the enemy home. They would show them there was nowhere in the galaxy they could hide. And they would make them understand that this war ended when humanity said it ended. She straightened in her command chair and gave the order. All ships advance. The human fleet surged forward like a spear thrown at the heart of an empire. The final battle had begun. General Vorath Keln watched the human ships approaching on his tactical display. He stood on the bridge of the last Dominion flagship with quiet dignity. Around him, his crew worked frantically, trying to coordinate a defense that was already falling apart. He felt a strange sense of peace. He had tried to warn them. He had done everything he could to prevent this moment. The council had not listened, and now the consequences had arrived. His tactical officer reported with panic in his voice. He said all defense platforms were engaging, but the human ships were not behaving as expected. They were taking hits that should destroy them, but they kept firing. They kept maneuvering. It was like they had completely disabled their safety systems. Vorath nodded slowly. He explained that the humans had done exactly that. They called it combat overload. They ran their reactors past safe limits. They ignored structural warnings and damage alerts. They traded their ship's survival for maximum combat effectiveness. His officer said that was insane. No rational species would fight that way. Vorath almost smiled. He said it was not insanity. It was humanity. They were not just willing to die for their cause. They expected to die. They had made peace with death before the battle even started, and that made them more dangerous than any enemy the Dominion had ever faced. He watched a human destroyer on the display. It was burning from a dozen wounds. Any Dominion ship would have withdrawn to seek repairs. Instead, the human vessel accelerated directly toward a defense platform. It crashed into the station at full speed, and the explosion consumed them both. Another human ship immediately moved to fill the gap in the line. No hesitation, no mourning. Just cold, efficient determination to complete the mission regardless of cost. Vorath turned to his aide and told him to contact the High Council. He said they needed to understand what was happening here. The aide worked his console for a moment and then looked up with fear in his eyes. He said he could not reach the council chambers. Communication lines were down across the entire planet. Vorath was not surprised. The humans had learned well during 3 years of war. They knew exactly how to blind an enemy and isolate their leadership. The Dominion was fighting in the dark, while the humans moved with perfect coordination. Another explosion lit up the display as a Dominion battlecruiser broke apart. Escape pods scattered from the wreckage, but human fighters swept through and destroyed them without mercy. There would be no survivors. There would be no prisoners. Vorath understood what was happening. This was not conquest. The humans were not trying to occupy Dominion space or subjugate its population. They were sending a message. They were demonstrating what happened to species that threatened humanity. He wondered if this was how it would end. He wondered if the humans would burn everything, destroy the homeworld, scatter the survivors, erase the Dominion from history the way the Dominion had erased so many other species. His tactical officer reported that the outer defense ring had fallen. Human ships were breaking through into the inner system. The homeworld would be within weapons range in less than 2 hours. Vorath gave orders calmly. He told his remaining ships to fall back and form a defensive sphere around the planet. He knew it would not stop the humans, but it might buy time. Time for what he did not know. He watched the battle continue on his display. Human ships moved through the Dominion formation with terrible grace. They found weaknesses and exploited them. They covered each other and supported each other. They fought like a single organism with a single will. The Dominion fleet fought bravely, but bravery was not enough. They were outnumbered in skill if not in ships. They were outmatched in determination if not in technology. One by one, their vessels fell silent. Vorath felt the deck shudder as his flagship took a hit. Damage reports flooded in, but he barely heard them. He was watching the human fleet close in on the homeworld, millions of his people down there looking up at the sky, wondering if they would live to see tomorrow. He gave one final order. He told his communications officer to broadcast a message on all frequencies. He surrendered unconditionally. He asked the humans for mercy. The human ships slowed their advance. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Then a single transmission came through. A human voice, calm and professional. The voice said surrender was accepted. All Dominion vessels were ordered to power down weapons and await further instructions. Any ship that failed to comply would be destroyed. Vorath slumped in his command chair. It was over. The mighty Dominion had fallen. 3 years of war had ended, not with a final glorious battle, but with a simple acknowledgement of defeat. He wondered what would come next. He wondered if humanity would show the mercy they had requested. He wondered if there would be anything left of his people when this was finished. Outside the observation window, human ships took up positions around the homeworld. Their weapons were silent but ready. The message was clear. The Dominion belonged to humanity now. Ambassador Linda Morrison walked through the Great Hall where she had delivered humanity's first protest 3 years before. The obsidian walls still stretched upward into darkness. The 12 thrones still loomed on their elevated platform. But everything had changed. 11 of those thrones were empty. Their occupants had fled or been removed from power in the chaos following the surrender. Only High Counselor Maven remained sitting alone in the center of so much abandoned authority. Morrison remembered the last time she had stood in this hall. She had been dismissed with contempt. Her warnings had been laughed at. The Dominion representative had told her that human concerns were irrelevant. Now human warships orbited the Dominion homeworld. Human soldiers maintained order in the capital. Human administrators were reviewing every aspect of the fallen empire. The species that had been called irrelevant had brought the mightiest civilization in the galaxy to its knees. Maven looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical injury. The silver had faded from her eyes. Her 4 arms hung limp at her sides. She looked like what she was, the last leader of a shattered empire waiting to learn her fate. Maven spoke first. Her voice was hollow and defeated. She said, the humans had won. The Dominion fleet was destroyed. The colonies were occupied. The homeworld was surrounded. She asked what more humanity wanted from them. Morrison clasped her hands behind her back and answered calmly. She said humanity wanted peace. They had always wanted peace. Maven made a sound that might have been a laugh. She said humanity had a strange way of pursuing peace. Morrison acknowledged this with a slight nod. She said they had learned from the best. 3 years ago she had told the Dominion representative to remember. She had said humanity always remembered. She did not think they had understood what she meant. She walked slowly toward the thrones. Her footsteps echoed in the empty chamber. She explained that humanity had been fighting wars since before they had words to describe them. They had conquered and been conquered. They had committed terrible acts and had terrible acts committed against them. They had learned every lesson about warfare that could be learned. She stopped at the base of Maven's throne and looked up at the defeated counselor. She said the most important lesson humanity had learned was simple. Wars end. They always end eventually. And when they end, you have to live with the people you were fighting. Maven stared down at her with confusion. She asked if Morrison truly expected her to believe humanity wanted coexistence after everything that had happened. After 3 years of death and destruction, Morrison said she expected Maven to believe that humans were not fools. Exterminating the Dominion species would require resources humanity could not spare. It would make them monsters in the eyes of the galaxy. Occupying the entire empire would stretch their forces too thin and create endless resistance. The only path forward was peace. Maven said bitterly that it would be peace on human terms. Morrison corrected her gently. She said it would be peace on fair terms. The Vethrani would get their worlds back. The Dominion military would be reduced to defensive capabilities only. Imperial expansion would stop permanently. In exchange, humanity would leave the homeworld intact and the population unharmed. Dominion culture would be preserved. She reached into her coat and produced a document. She said this was a draft peace treaty. Full cessation of hostilities. Mutual recognition of sovereignty. Trade agreements and cultural exchange. A framework for two civilizations to coexist. Maven took the document with trembling hands. She read it slowly. Her expression shifted from suspicion to confusion, to something that looked almost like wonder. She said the terms were generous, more generous than the Dominion had ever offered to any conquered species. Morrison said the terms were practical. Humanity had no interest in revenge. Revenge was expensive and pointless. They had interest in a stable galaxy where their children could grow up without fear of invasion. She met Maven's gaze steadily. She said the Dominion had made a mistake 3 years ago. They had pushed humanity when they should have left them alone. But mistakes could be corrected. The question was whether the Dominion was wise enough to correct this one. Maven was silent for a long time. She looked at the document in her hands. She looked at the empty thrones around her. She looked at the human ambassador standing calmly before her. Finally, she nodded slowly. She said she would need to consult with whoever remained of the Dominion government. But she believed they could accept these terms. Morrison allowed herself a small smile. She said that was good. She said it was time to end this war and build something better. 3 months later, General Vorath Kelm stood on a balcony overlooking the capital city. The scars of war were still visible. Damaged buildings and memorial sites, and the constant presence of human peacekeepers. But life was returning to normal. Markets were reopening. Children were playing in the streets. The long nightmare was finally ending. Ambassador Morrison joined him at the railing. She said he had been right 3 years ago, when he warned the Council about humanity. She wondered if that brought him any satisfaction. Vorath considered her words carefully. He said he had been right about what humanity could do. He had been wrong about what they would do. Morrison asked him to explain. Vorath said he had expected destruction if humanity won. That was what Dominion history suggested. The Empire had conquered many species over the millennia. They had never shown mercy to those who resisted. He had assumed humans would be the same. He turned to face her. He said instead humanity had shown mercy. Despite everything the Dominion had done to them. Despite the lives that had been lost. Humanity could have burned their worlds and enslaved their people and erased their culture. Instead, they had offered peace. Morrison was quiet for a moment. She said humanity had learned hard lessons about vengeance. Every time they had crushed an enemy completely, they had regretted it. The resentment festered. The wounds never healed. The wars just started again in the next generation. She looked out at the city below. She said humanity had decided long ago that they would rather have neighbors than subjects. It was harder. It required more patience. But it worked better in the end. Vorath asked what would have happened if the Dominion had refused the peace offer. Morrison answered honestly. She said humanity would have done what they had to do. But she was glad refusal had not been necessary. Vorath studied her face. This small, fragile creature who represented a species that had humbled the mightiest empire in the galaxy. There was no triumph in her expression. No gloating. Just a kind of weary hope. He said he thought the galaxy had much to learn from humanity. Morrison smiled. She said humanity had much to learn from everyone else. That was the whole point. Learning from each other. Growing together. Building something that none of them could build alone. She extended her hand in the human gesture of agreement. She welcomed him to the galactic community. She said it was going to be an interesting future. Vorath took her hand carefully. He was mindful of how fragile human bones were, despite the strength of human spirit. He agreed that the future would be interesting indeed. Above them, the stars shone down on a galaxy that had finally found its way to peace. The war was over. The dead were mourned, and two civilizations that had nearly destroyed each other were taking their first steps toward something new. Humanity had proven what they were capable of in war. Now they would prove what they were capable of in peace. And somewhere across the vast reaches of space, other species watched and wondered and began to understand. The humans were not conquerors. They were not destroyers. They were something far more remarkable. They were builders. And they were just getting started. Supreme Commander Vex stood before the Conquest Gallery, watching holographic displays of 1,000 burning worlds. Each image represented a species that had fallen before the Krithak's dominion. Each one had tried to resist. Each one had failed. The command chamber hummed with quiet efficiency as officers reviewed tactical data from their latest victory. The Salthan Collective had surrendered after only 3 days of fighting. Their military commanders had watched Krithak's soldiers march through plasma fire without hesitation, without breaking formation, without showing the slightest concern for survival. The Salthan broke first. They always did. "Commander, the planetary scans are complete," Officer Drex reported, his voice flat and mechanical. Emotion was inefficient. The Krithaks had evolved past such weaknesses long ago. Vex turned from the gallery, his tall frame casting shadows across the metallic floor. His species had no concept of fear built into their biology. Where other races possessed neural structures that triggered panic, hesitation, or self-preservation instincts, the Krithaks had nothing. They could calculate risk, but they could not feel dread. They understood death as data, not as something to avoid at all costs. This made them perfect conquerors. "Show me the resources," Vex commanded. Holographic charts filled the air between them. Mineral deposits, water reserves, agricultural potential. The Salthan homeworld would serve the Dominion well. Already, occupation forces were establishing control grids across major population centers. The natives would work, or they would be removed. Simple calculations. "Any resistance movements detected?" Vex asked. 17 forming in southern territories, Drex answered. "Projected suppression time. 4 days." Vex nodded once. Resistance was predictable. Species always clung to hope, even after defeat. That hope would fade quickly enough when they realized the Krithaks could not be intimidated, could not be frightened into retreat, could not be broken by threats or shows of force. Fear worked both ways in war. The Krithaks felt none, which meant enemy psychological tactics failed completely. Meanwhile, their own relentless advance broke enemy spirits in days rather than years. The tactical screens shifted, showing battle footage from the Salthan campaign. Krithak soldiers advanced through streets, while enemy forces fired from fortified positions. Several Krithaks fell, bodies torn apart by explosive rounds. The soldiers behind them stepped over the corpses without pausing, without changing expression, without the slightest acknowledgement that death walked beside them. They simply calculated new approach vectors and continued forward. That was when defenders broke. That was when they realized they faced something unnatural. "Commander, the Galactic Council has sent another communication," an officer announced from the communications station. "Delete it," Vex said without looking up. "They threaten economic sanctions. They have threatened sanctions for the past 47 conquests. They will continue threatening. They will not act." Vex pulled up a star chart showing Krithak's territory, spreading like a dark stain across the galaxy map. Fear governs their decisions. They fear the cost of opposing us more than they hate what we do. The irony was not lost on him. The very emotion his species lacked was the tool they used most effectively against others. Every species they encountered was controlled by fear to some degree. Fear of death, fear of pain, fear of loss. The Krithaks simply had to exist, had to demonstrate their absolute lack of survival instinct, and enemy forces crumbled. "What is our next target?" Drex asked. Vex expanded the star chart, highlighting sectors beyond their current borders. The mapping division had been conducting deep space surveys for months, cataloging potential conquests. Several promising systems appeared in the display, each color-coded by strategic value. "Sector 7. An analyst spoke up. "Scout ships returned yesterday. With preliminary reports. Show me." A blue-white planet appeared in the hologram, rotating slowly. Oceans covered most of its surface, with large land masses scattered across hemispheres. Preliminary scans showed significant technological development. Cities, agriculture, industrial complexes, defense satellites in orbit. though nothing that would pose a real challenge to Krithak's fleet power. Species designation? Vex asked. They call themselves humans, the analyst replied. Single-planet civilization. Approximately 8 billion population. Technology level comparable to the Velthan hegemony before their conquest. Vex remembered the Velthan campaign. 6 days from first contact to complete surrender. The Velthan had possessed impressive weapons technology. But their warrior culture had been built entirely around honor and courage. When they encountered an enemy that felt no honor and needed no courage because they could not feel fear, their entire military philosophy collapsed. Military capabilities? Standard orbital defense platforms, nuclear weapons in their early space-age range, chemical propulsion spacecraft, ground forces equipped with projectile and energy weapons. Nothing exceptional. The analyst paused. They do have extensive cultural data available through their communication networks. They appear to value individual freedom highly. This may make occupation more complex than standard protocols. Vex dismissed the concern with a gesture. Every species valued something. Every species had cultural elements they believed made them special. None of it mattered when faced with an enemy that could not be deterred by sacrifice, martyrdom, or last stands. The Krithaks would land. They would establish control. The humans would resist briefly, then submit to mathematical inevitability. Prepare First Fleet, Vex ordered. Standard pacification protocols. Begin with orbital superiority, followed by demonstration strikes, followed by ground occupation of major population centers. Estimated conquest time? Drex inquired. Vex studied the planet, rotating in the hologram. The humans had spread across their world with impressive efficiency. Their cities showed sophisticated organization. Their satellite network indicated advanced communication systems. But none of that would matter against an enemy they could not frighten and could not outlast. 1 week for initial surrender, Vex calculated. 2 additional weeks for complete occupation. Officers moved to execute his commands, their movements precise and emotionless. Within hours, First Fleet would leave Krithak space and begin the jump toward the human homeworld. Within days, another species would learn what the galaxy had already discovered. Nothing could stop the fearless. Vex turned back to the conquest gallery, already imagining a new hologram added to the collection. A blue-white planet, wreathed in the red glow of Krithak's occupation. Earth, they called it. Soon, it would simply be Conquest 742. He felt no anticipation, no excitement, no bloodlust. He felt nothing except the cold satisfaction of efficient execution. Another world, another victory, another proof that in a universe governed by fear, the species that felt none would always triumph. The command chamber doors sealed behind him as he left to oversee fleet preparations. Behind him, the conquest gallery continued its silent display. 1,000 dead worlds bearing witness to the unstoppable advance of the fearless Krithak's dominion. The Krithak's First Fleet emerged from jump space at the edge of the solar system. 97 warships, arranged in perfect geometric formation. Within minutes, their sensors mapped every human satellite, defense platform, and military installation. The calculations confirmed initial assessments. Earth possessed nothing that could threaten them. Supreme Commander Vex stood on the bridge of the flagship, watching Earth grow larger in the view screen. The blue planet looked peaceful from this distance, clouds drifting across oceans, city lights visible on the night side. Appearances meant nothing. Soon those cities would fly Krithak's banners, open all communication channels. Vex ordered. Broadcast surrender terms in their dominant languages. The message went out across every frequency humanity used. The terms were simple and non-negotiable. Lay down all weapons. Submit to Krithak's authority. Resistance would be met with overwhelming force. Compliance would allow human civilization to continue under occupation. The choice was theirs, but the outcome was predetermined. 37 minutes passed before Earth responded. A holographic display activated, showing a human woman in formal diplomatic attire. She appeared calm, her face neutral, her posture composed. The translation software identified her as Ambassador Min-ji Park, representative of the Unified Human Defense Council. "This is Ambassador Park speaking on behalf of Earth," she began, her voice steady. "We have received your terms. We request time to discuss your demands with our global leadership. Such a decision cannot be made hastily." Vex studied her face, analyzing micro-expressions with Krithak's precision. Humans possessed sophisticated emotional responses. Their biology was saturated with fear mechanisms, adrenaline systems, panic triggers. Yet this ambassador showed none of the obvious signs. Either she was exceptionally disciplined, or humanity had more control over their emotional responses than typical species. "You have 6 hours," Vex replied. "At the end of that time, we will begin demonstrations of our capabilities. Further delays will result in increased casualties." Min-ji nodded once. 6 hours. Understood. The communication ended. Vex turned to his tactical officer. "Monitor all human military movements. Catalog defensive preparations." What followed over the next 6 hours was predictable. Human forces mobilized worldwide. Fighter craft launched from air bases. Naval vessels moved to combat stations. Ground forces established defensive perimeters around major cities. Civilian populations began evacuation procedures, flooding roads and transit systems in patterns that suggested panic. "They are afraid," Drex observed, watching the tactical displays. "Standard fear. Response to superior force," Vex agreed. The human reaction matched every previous conquest. Fear drove them to pointless defensive measures that would accomplish nothing against Krithak's technology. Fear sent civilians fleeing from cities in chaotic patterns that disrupted their own military logistics. Fear made them predictable. When 6 hours expired, Min-ji Park appeared again on the communication channel. "We need more time," she said simply. "Our political systems require extensive consultation." "Denied," Vex responded. "Beginning demonstrations." He cut the channel and issued targeting orders. 3 demonstration strikes, calculated for maximum psychological impact with minimum strategic damage. The first targeted an uninhabited island in the Pacific Ocean. The second vaporized an abandoned industrial complex in a remote region. The third destroyed a decommissioned military base that satellites confirmed was empty. The message was clear. Krithak's weapons could strike anywhere on Earth with perfect precision. Resistance was futile. "Deploy landing forces," Vex commanded. "Begin with coastal cities. Establish control grids in high population centers." The first wave launched from fleet carriers, dropships cutting through Earth's atmosphere in controlled descents. They landed in 12 cities simultaneously, choosing locations near government centers and military installations. Krithak soldiers emerged from the craft in perfect formation, weapons ready, prepared for whatever resistance humans offered. What happened next confused every calculation. The first landing zone in Los Angeles showed typical patterns initially. Human military forces had established defensive positions around the landing site. As Krithak's soldiers advanced, humans opened fire with conventional weapons. Bullets and energy blasts struck Krithak's infantry, some finding gaps in armor, some killing soldiers outright. The Krithaks did not slow down. They never did. They walked through the defensive fire with mechanical precision, calculating trajectories, returning fire with superior accuracy. Human forces should have broken at that point. Seeing an enemy advance without hesitation should have triggered panic responses. Instead, human soldiers retreated in organized patterns, falling back into the city streets in ways that suggested planning rather than panic. "They are implementing urban warfare tactics," the tactical officer reported. "Using buildings for cover, establishing crossfire positions, employing hit and run strikes." Vex frowned. not at the tactics themselves, which were standard for defending forces, but at the execution. Humans should be breaking down by now. Fear should be overwhelming their command structure. Instead, they were fighting with disciplined efficiency. In Tokyo, the pattern repeated. In Mumbai, in Sao Paulo, human forces engaged, inflicted casualties, then melted into urban terrain. Before Krithak's forces could establish overwhelming superiority, they were not standing and fighting. They were harassing, disrupting, forcing the Krithaks to fight for every block. Casualties? Vex asked. 17% of landing forces engaged in combat, higher than projected. 17% in the first day. That exceeded losses from the entire Velthan campaign. Vex studied tactical feeds from multiple cities, watching Krithak soldiers advance through streets that seemed abandoned, only to face sudden ambushes from unexpected angles. Night fell across Earth's surface, and the nature of the combat changed. Human forces began using darkness as a weapon. They cut power to city blocks, plunging streets into shadow, then struck from concealed positions. Krithak soldiers had superior night vision technology, but humans were employing tactics that seemed designed specifically to create confusion rather than achieve military victories. In New York, a Krithak's patrol entered an abandoned subway station, pursuing retreating human forces. What they found was darkness, strange sounds echoing through tunnels, and a series of small, explosive charges that killed 3 soldiers while accomplishing no strategic objective. The survivors reported difficulty determining enemy positions due to acoustic interference. In Berlin, human forces broadcast high-frequency sound through city streets that disrupted Krithak's communication equipment. The sounds accomplished nothing militarily, but forced soldiers to fight without coordination for 17 minutes until jamming countermeasures could be deployed. In Seoul, a Krithak's company encountered something unprecedented. They entered a residential district that appeared evacuated. As they advanced, children's music began playing from speakers throughout the area. Then laughter. Then screams. The sounds came from every direction, overlapping, creating a wall of noise that served no tactical purpose Vex could identify. Yet it delayed the advance by 40 minutes while soldiers cleared every building to locate the source. "Commander," Drex said carefully, "human tactics are not following standard patterns. They are expending resources on psychological operations that should be ineffective against Krithak's forces." Vex studied the data. Drex was correct. Humans were using fear-based tactics against an enemy that felt no fear. They were wasting ammunition on harassment strikes instead of concentrated defense. They were prioritizing confusion over casualties. They do not understand what they face, Vex concluded. They employ tactics designed for enemies that can be frightened. Once they realize these methods are useless, they will adapt or collapse. But even as he spoke the words, doubt crept into his calculations for the first time in his military career. Not fear, which he could not feel, but simple mathematical uncertainty. The projected conquest timeline was already exceeding estimates. Human resistance was lasting longer than it should, not because they were stronger, but because they were behaving irrationally. On the view screen, Earth rotated slowly, city lights dimming as humans cut power to deny Krithak's targeting data. Somewhere down there, Minji Park and 8 billion humans were making decisions that did not fit any model Vex understood. He logged the first day as a tactical delay, not a defeat. Tomorrow, Krithak's forces would double their deployment. Human resistance would be crushed through overwhelming numerical superiority. But as he reviewed casualty reports from 12 cities, watching footage of humans employing tactics that made no logical sense, Vex experienced something his species had no word for. It was not fear, but it was the cold recognition that he had made an error in his calculations. He simply did not know yet what that error was. 3 months had passed since the first Krithak's landing, and Supreme Commander Vex stared at reports that contradicted everything his species understood about conquest. The Krithaks controlled every major Earth city. Their forces occupied government centers, military bases, and strategic infrastructure. By every military metric, Earth had fallen. Yet human resistance had not ended. It had evolved. Captain Jae-sung Choi crouched in the ruins of what had once been a shopping district in Seoul, watching a Krithax patrol move through the rubble-strewn street below. 15 enemy soldiers, standard formation, sweeping sector by sector with mechanical precision. They showed no caution, no hesitation, no concern for ambush. They could not feel fear, which meant they walked into every trap humans set. Jae-sung had learned that lesson in the first week of occupation. The Krithax were not brave. Bravery required overcoming fear. They were simply empty of survival instinct. He signaled to his team, scattered through buildings on both sides of the street. 12 humans, armed with improvised weapons and salvaged military equipment. They were not soldiers by training. Jae-sung had been a civil engineer before the invasion. His team included teachers, factory workers, medical technicians. But 3 months of survival had taught them what formal military training could not. How to fight an enemy that felt nothing. The Krithax patrol reached the intersection. Speakers hidden throughout the district activated simultaneously, broadcasting sounds humans had spent weeks perfecting. Screaming. Laughter. Whispers in languages the Krithax could not understand. Children crying, glass breaking. The sounds overlapped and echoed, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The patrol stopped, not from fear but from tactical confusion. Their sensors detected no targets, only audio signatures. They began scanning buildings systematically, trying to locate the source. This was exactly what Jae-sung wanted. While they focused on phantom sounds, his team activated the real trap. The street beneath them collapsed. Not entirely, just enough to trap their legs in rubble and twisted metal. Then the explosives detonated, carefully placed charges that killed 8 soldiers instantly. The survivors tried to establish defensive positions, but they were trapped, unable to move, unable to feel the panic that would have driven other species to desperate action. Jae-sung's team picked them off methodically, firing from concealed positions the Krithax could not reach. Within 4 minutes, the patrol was eliminated. Within 5, the resistance cell had vanished into tunnels beneath the city, leaving no trace except bodies and confusion. This was the new pattern. Humans did not fight Krithax's strength directly.